Hey everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this last panel in our teach-in. So this is a presentation on Jewish radicalism from then to now by organizers of the Workers' Circle, which is a social justice organization centered around Jewish identity and progressive politics. And we have two panelists. Brit is a senior at Barnard College and a college organizer with the Workers' Circle. And Jonathan Taubes is a social justice associate at the Workers' Circle and a proud member of Central Brooklyn DSA. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emmeline. And I am Jonathan Taubes, and yep, just like you mentioned, social justice associate at the Workers' Circle. Basically, I work with Brit and another one of our incredible college organizers, Noah Barron, who I just saw introduce himself in the chat. Hi, Noah, and helped us a lot with this presentation, which we're super psyched for. So thanks for that too. I help rep us at functions like this, though to be totally honest, this is definitely one of the cooler functions at which I get to rep. So happy about that. I'm from Teaneck, New Jersey originally, now in Central Brooklyn. Shout out to YDSA for your great organizing around this. And yeah, I'll kick it off to Brit to intro themselves.
Yeah, so I'm Brit. I'm a senior at Barnard, and I work for the Workers' Circle. And I just want to say a little bit about the college network and what it means to me to be able to ground my organizing in my Jewish identity and Jewish history proudly and authentically, which I think is a unique space for college students, especially working on domestic issues. So back to Jonathan.
Great. So today we are going to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is Jewish radicalism. I want to say that around Workers' Circle, sort of around the organization, I'm often called the historian because, yeah, Brit can attest to this. Because I'm always the one who's sharing, some old union history, something about our Jewish socialist roots, roots which are certainly unique for a nonprofit, right? Because Workers' Circle right now is a 501c3 organization. We'll talk more about, how it started. And frankly, I think those roots are unique for like any organization. So I'm going to lean into that. And I'm going to talk a bit about the political and cultural climate from which our organization, the Workers' Circle, emerged, how and why this sort of milieu was instrumental, really not just to the Jewish labor movement at the time, in the first half of the 20th century mostly, but really the labor movement as a whole, especially in New York City. So I'm going to share this mostly in broad themes and takeaways from our history, of course, illustrated through specific examples. One just heads up is that while I'm talking, of course, a lot, and Britt will be talking about Workers' Circle history, we're also just talking about like Jewish left labor history as a whole, which Workers' Circle sort of had a hand in every bot of what was going on. So just bear that in mind. So then after I share some of this history, Brit, who is a Barnard student and also a wonderful Jewish leftist and incidentally a fantastic political organizer, is going to really drive home some of these concrete takeaways and lessons as far as it relates to the Columbia administration today, and trying to echo and highlight some of the demands that have been made by the organizers and by the strikers that really register most strongly with our organizational history. Then finally, we'll wrap up. We'll open it to any questions. So think of this as some Workers' Circle education as a way of highlighting social and political realities that exist today, to highlight some of these inequities, some of these exploitative practices that exist in a whole lot of places, but that we're seeing at Columbia, and other ostensibly liberal, progressive, institutions across the country that, they purport very often to be liberal and forward-thinking, but we know how this sort of rhetoric can actually be used and is used to disguise the material realities and the power dynamics that actually exist. This strike with thousands of students participating, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, And if anyone wants to jump in, last I checked, it was 4,300 plus. That's incredible. And such brilliant organizing already, so effectively calling attention to power, and namely that students and workers should have more of it. We're a fan of that, and so we just want to echo some of that from our particular historical vantage point and our unique Jewish leftist frame of reference. So before I start, because I'm going to be talking for a couple more minutes and I'm going to dive into it, but I want to turn to Brit and see if there's anything else you wanted to add sort of about what this heritage and legacy means to you, how that informs you.
Yeah, definitely. I think, even if I weren't Jewish, I would absolutely be a progressive, but I think the combination of the two is really fruitful in terms of having a strong communal background for your organizing, as well as being able to draw on the history that Jonathan's about to talk about to inform sort of how I view the labor landscape more broadly now.
Oh yeah. So echoing that, I'm gonna just dive into it and tell you where we're coming from. So first thing to start with is that the Workers' Circle is a 120-year-old organization. So we've been around for some time. It is a progressive, left, labor-aligned social justice 501c3 organization. Now, it was founded in 1900 by Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants as a mutual aid society. So that's been something I've been thinking a lot, as this pandemic has sort of laid bare, just not just the inequality, but the fact that like the state is so ill-equipped to just provide for people on like a very, very basic level. I've been thinking like, wow, there are some parallels, at the organization that I work for. So that's how it's founded, as a mutual aid society. Very quickly after that, there's an infusion of Bundists into the organization. So for those of you who are here and who are sort of in the lefty Jewish world, you know what that means. But not everyone is, though, for me, living so much of my life in that, it can feel that way sometimes. So what that basically means, who the Bundists were these people who were radical socialists, and they were firmly committed to working class political organizing. I mean, they were deeply anti-capitalist. In a sense, they're people who we could actually call democratic socialists. They believed in engaging sort of with electoral politics and parliamentary stuff. And also, of course, organizing unions and fighting cops in the streets and that sort of thing as well. So that's sort of their vibe. But I do want to point out that it's interesting that these people also were proud Yiddishists, right? And I'll elaborate a bit more on what that means, but they were committed to engaging with and preserving and creating Yiddish culture, Yiddish art, Yiddish language. They actually don't see that as a contradiction with their socialist identity. And that's something that was controversial, especially in Eastern Europe, where a lot of these folks were coming from, right? So they're politically engaged before they get here, a lot of them. Some of them not. Some of them were radicalized by, the sort of desperate working conditions, which we will definitely get into. But again, it's just interesting because this is sort of during this time that we can call the old left, right, as distinct from the new left in the 60s, which, folks, we all know, like, that had such clear and like important consequences and dramatic situations at Columbia in 1968. So the old left, though, was like very, like, so they were old school, like, we're going to build labor unions. We're going to build working class power. And we support that to varying degrees of militancy and revolutionary fervor. Some might say, and some have said, in fact, and this was the critique of the new left, that they basically were class reductionists. The old left were class reductionists. That, of course, is a very loaded term, and it's it's something worth unpacking. But that was the vibe, and it's interesting, though, just to say again, like, so these were people who really created and founded the Workers' Circle, who again were like socialists and the union makes a strong solidarity forever, but were really committed to Yiddish cultural autonomy. Um, let's see where I want to go from there. So what the Workers' Circle helps do, and by the way, I should say that it was founded as the Workmen's Circle, or in Yiddish, der Arbeiterring, which is just the Yiddish translation of that. We changed it recently to make it more progressive and more gender neutral, and also as a nod to sort of, worker solidarity kind of thing. But back then, that's what it was called. And it helps acculturate these immigrants into America. So maybe can we get the first slide? I think it is that has that's it. 1934 May Day rally. You can see there's a sign there. There's quite a bit of Yiddish that I actually can't make out in here. Maybe some people in the audience are scrutinizing it as we speak. But if you see that sign, I believe it's the second sign from the left, the Workmen's Circle School prepares a new generation to fight for the socialist cause. So I see that and I'm like, yeah, rad. Like, yes, we should teach Jews in school to be socialists. That's a great thing. And this was actually, this was decades already after the organization had formed in the midst of the Depression. So, and we're good for that slide. That's all we need for now. So it helps acculturate people into America, in addition to the sort of political activism and of course showing up en masse at rallies and that sort of thing. There's cultural engagement. There's schools, which that sign referred to. So this is a place for poor and working class Jewish youth. Their parents were immigrants. Maybe they are immigrants too, to get like a really actually quality education for free or near cheap. Cheap or near free. And another thing that they offered was unemployment benefits, which I'm going to speak a bit about, more about later in a second. Another thing that they offer were burial plots. Actually, my late grandmother is buried right across from a Workmen's Circle cemetery plot in New Jersey. And I didn't know that until a couple of years ago, or I didn't notice it. And I went there and I was like, oh, I happened to be working for this organization, and wow, they were really all over the place, weren't they? Could we pop up the slide on Workers' Circle's unemployment policies? So this is really interesting. I actually, some of the real lefties here will appreciate this. I found this looking on Marxist.org, and I just searched like, oh, and of course, this is what came up because they were so deeply involved in the movement at that time. This was in an article that was written in 1931, towards the couple years into the Great Depression. Bear in mind, Herbert Hoover is still president at this time. FDR and his New Deal were still a couple years away. So it's a really desperate and horrible time in a lot of ways. Just a desperate and horrible time. And let me read from this quote. The more widespread unemployment has become, the more acute and ramified the whole problem has grown. The results which the present unemployment has brought in its wake are beginning to be felt more and more in every nook and corner of our social fabric. Not only do the wage workers, who are the direct victims of the terribly abnormal situation, feel it, but the middle class and the various philanthropic and cultural institutions are also beginning to feel it. So I just want to pause there for a sec, because when I read that, I was like, wow, that's really, like, this was actually not written in like a radical socialist journal, to my knowledge. I don't know that the Jewish Social Service Quarterly was run by socialists. Maybe it was, so don't quote me on that. But what I was struck by is just how clearer the political discourse of that time seemed to be, where it's like, yes, there are the wage workers and like the middle classes, various philanthropic institutions. It seems to me on the left, we could do for some more clarification, and our whole political discourse could really do for more clarification just around, describing material reality in like honest ways. And my good friend John Mermelstein is in the chat saying he agrees. What's up, John? I'm gonna read from that second part of the quote. However, this organization did not suffer by it, for the more unemployment became widespread, the more the Workmen's Circle institutions began to apply all their resources towards the alleviation of the heavy burden which the crisis had placed upon the shoulders of members. So that's we're good on that slide for now. And he goes on to describe how exactly the worker circle was helping its unemployed members during the Depression. Just a couple very interesting things were, first off, medical care. So Worker Circle had clinics. They had clinics which they were offering to unemployed members for free or very, very close to it. They would refer folks to nurses for those who were ill but and needed some kind of short-term care. They also referred to whatever relevant government services existed at the time. So bear in mind, if you're an immigrant, you're an immigrant family, and you're just like sort of getting acclimated, or at this point, really it's the 30s, so your parents maybe speak Yiddish as a primary language. I mean, we see how this plays out in immigrant communities today, where like state services, it can be like really archaic and you have no idea what the hell is going on. So part of what the institution served, again, of course, with this labor piece, which we are going to get into, but part of the real floor of it is this sense of like a place where you can get help. And if you don't know what's up, people will refer to that. And the last part of the article that really struck me was that they provided free education for those families who needed it and were unemployed and could not afford it. And there were 100 plus workmen's circle schools around the country at that time, with, I would have to assume, thousands of students. So this is really a lot of what the Worker Circle was about. And by the way, forgive me, the name change was pretty recent. And so if I say workmen's and then workers, you know what I'm talking about. I promise it's the same institution. Though I suppose that would be classic, the left to have these two warring factions with very similar names. In fact, though, they are the same institution. So we're talking about a politically active and unionist group with lots of education, cultural services going on. But at its root, what they're doing is they're meeting the demands of its poor and working class members who are in need. Now, I want to shift from there to talk about the conditions that many Jewish working class immigrants were facing at the time. So one major site of employment for Jewish workers were sweatshops. And there's a picture there that I want to get up. So this is a pants factory in New York City in 1937. You see the cramped conditions in this picture. You see that there are, as far as I can tell, no visible windows. It seems like a pretty crummy place to work. And I want to call your attention to another interesting dynamic that's actually we're gonna just mention later, which is if you look on the left, you can see a couple Black men who are working there. And on the right, you see some white women, likely Jewish or Italian women. And that's going to become important later when we talk about what multi-ethnic and multiracial organizing within the labor movement. So take note of that. Get another look at that. And that's it for the sweatshop slide. So during the 20th century, American textile workers of all categories and female workers in particular, like I just said, we're really subjected to these horrible conditions marked by exactly what you saw and probably worse examples that could be found, crowded, unsanitary facilities, long workdays, and miserable poverty wages. Production in the garment making capital of NYC during the first decade of the century was split between about 600 shops and factories. It employed 30,000 workers and produced an estimated $50 million worth of merchandising annually. So this was really the site of the garment industry. It was here in New York City. Women were frequently trapped by an internal subcontracting system, which relied on the use of homework and also limited entry into these skilled operator positions by forcing many of them to the ranks of learners, which, by the way, was a completely made up category by the employers to exploit women, working class, young immigrant women, teenagers a lot of the time. I mean, these were people who were like college age and younger kind of thing, as we would understand it today. The learners often made no more than $3 or $4 a day, which is, a fraction of the typical wages of $7 to $12, which were made by the operators who, unsurprisingly, were generally male. And at the top of the industry hierarchy were the skilled pattern makers and cutters, who were also almost exclusively male. But the bulk of the workers are actually women. Jewish immigrant women, to a lesser extent, Italian women workers. And that's also important to hold on to, because as we're going to see, the leaders and pioneers, the real radicals and heroes of the Jewish labor movement at the time, are overwhelmingly women. And that's interesting because, we think of sort of the sexual liberation and feminism in the 60s, but these were like real working class warriors who were leading the charge in a lot of ways at the turn of the century. Most of them immigrants or children of immigrants, and most of them very young. So I just want to illustrate that for a second. And to do that, I'm going to take you to the year 1909. All the conditions I mentioned before are very much true and alive and well. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union has been around at this point for less than 10 years, right? So that union has a lot of association with the Workers' Circle. Many of the leadership of the union also is the leadership of our organization. The people know each other, so it's that sort of thing. The leadership is often interchangeable throughout the decades. So the union exists at this point, but here's a couple things worth noting. It's actually dominated, first of all, overwhelmingly by men. And so the leadership of the Ladies Garment Worker Union is overwhelmingly male. So kind of weird and messed up, and we're thinking about. And we also know from before how the women workers were further exploited and frankly screwed out of what they clearly deserved. Now, the date is November 22nd, 1909. There's a massive meeting at Cooper Union. The male leaders of the union are talking in these sort of very general terms about solidarity. They're using some of the right language, but really they're cautioning the workers against the possibility of a strike, against the possibility of a general strike. And the men go on and on, droning for several hours. Now, the union up until this point was much more geared towards representing these skilled pattern makers and cutters, who again were overwhelmingly male. Now, a few hours in, one woman, Clara Lemlich, and let's pop up her picture now because she's a legend. Let's see the Clara picture. Thanks, Emmeline. Who I think she was 19 years old at the time. Not sure how old she was in that picture. But I mean, you can tell she's like a short Jewish woman with like a lot of fire, as we're gonna see. She cries out at this meeting after these hours and hours of, annoying speeches from the back of the room. Look, I have something to say. And all right, so now Clara was an immigrant from Ukraine. She'd spent years in the sweatshops at this point as a girl. I mean, this was how she grew up. And this teenager, this young woman, storms the stage. And as the history goes, she declares in Yiddish, "The time for talk is over. I call right now for a general strike." And she is met immediately with roars of approval from the rank and file. At that moment, the co-founder of the Workers' Circle, Benjamin Feigenbaum, I believe he was also the president at the time, was on the stage with Clara at that moment. What he does is he raises Clara's right hand and administers an oath in Yiddish in solidarity. He goes, "Should I turn traitor to my cause?" And Clara is repeating this. "Should I turn traitor to my cause, may my arm wither and die from the place that I now raise it." And then the crowd repeats that back. Thousands and thousands of workers. And also, let me just quickly explain the resonance of that line in particular. It actually comes from a classic sort of Hebrew saying. I'll say it in Hebrew. It's "Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini." It's, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let me forget my right hand. So this goes back to, that's in the liturgy, right? And so there's this sort of biblical intensity to this moment, and everyone there understands that, even though they were secular Jews, but they were sort of familiar with that vernacular. And there's this almost biblically epic moment where they just, imagine thousands of workers roaring, in approval at their own power that they're about to realize. So the next day, 15,000 garment workers walk off their jobs as part of the strike, inspired by Clara Lemlich. who, basically made it happen against this conservative leadership. And then leadership, of course, is like, their hand was pretty much forced, and that ends up shaping the character of the union. The next day, there's 5,000 more workers who are joined by them. And yep, and you can see now this is the uprising of the 20,000. 20,000 workers, striking and marching through New York City. Check out that sign on the right. It says abolish wage slavery, and I think then on the left, the girl who's wearing that, I think that says the same thing in Yiddish. And the headline over there says 30,000 wastemakers. So it could have been even more. So this is the labor upsurge that we now know as the uprising of 20,000. Clara Lemlich, Jewish leftist hero, helped start it all. And after several months of striking, in February 2010, they finally settled with the factory owners, gaining improved wages, better working conditions, and better hours. So this is a landmark moment for the American labor movement. I want to move on just to talk about just to stress the fact that this was really controversial and scary, and we shouldn't take for granted that there wasn't really the union to lean on yet in this industry, because the union movement was still being formed in that way, right? So the character of the labor movement is being formed and fleshed out and created in motion through praxis, as it were, in real time through this strike of predominantly Jewish and Italian working class women, and again, really girls. Interestingly, just a note about Clara, she was a lifelong socialist and actually a communist too. And one interesting quip that I just heard actually from my girlfriend the other day is that Clara was organizing in her old age home, and I forget for what, but she was in some old age home and was radicalizing all the people who were there. So she could not stop. And another interesting point is that, again, she addresses the crowd in Yiddish, which she spoke and which everyone else, or most people there understood. And she uses that almost biblically resonant phrase to make it work with the crowd, to use that shared language. But she herself wasn't as much of a Yiddish cultural autonomist like we were talking about before. Of course, she knew and worked with and through the workers' circle throughout her career. She understood the value of that. But she herself was not one of those diehard, I'm going to really commit myself to the Yiddish language kind of people, as far as I know. Now, that's an interesting theme and transitions to the next part that I just wanted to mention, which is the role of culture and the role that leaning into different cultures can play in a multi-ethnic, multiracial movement. So we can really see this clearly in Dan Katz's work. Dan Katz is a labor scholar and was definitely a union organizer at some point, I believe. And shameless plug, he's on our board, but I'm not. He's actually the man, so it's that's why I'm plugging him. And he wrote a lovely book called Altogether Different: Yiddish Socialists, Garment Workers, and the Labor Roots of Multiculturalism. And we are just going to draw now from his article called Why We Need Yiddish Socialism Again. Thanks for popping that up. So I'm going to read just a bit of this, and there's a couple slides after too, but we felt it was really, really important to sort of drive this home. So check this out. With the victory of the uprising, Russian Jewish women and some men who had been raised within a culture of revolution now had a foothold in the ILGWU and the fledgling American labor movement. Among the most important and lasting contributions, shirtwaist makers began to build educational programs and structures that became the prototype of American labor education. It was a means to uplift workers who were barred or could not afford further education. It was also the vehicle through which Yiddish socialist principles were conveyed. They built libraries, held classes in Yiddish and English literature, world history, humanist philosophy, and socialist economics, and organized dances and excursions, all designed to engage workers as militant activists and intellectuals and to build a community of trust. Next slide, please. When workers of other racial ethnic groups entered the workforce, Yiddish socialists were ready to appeal to them not just individually, but through their cultures. The presence of a large minority of Italian garment workers was encouraged by factory owners in the hopes of dividing the workforce through suspicion. Solidarity among Jews and Italians was cultivated by Jewish organizers and their Italian allies. Rose Schneiderman, one of the few paid female organizers in any union, began to reach out to Italian community leaders, including Catholic priests, to build support for the union among Italian garment workers who began to enter the industry even before the uprising of 20,000. Through education and eventually facilities of their own, the ILGWU created spaces for Italians to explore their ethnic heritage in the union context. In 1916, mostly male cloak makers formed the All-Italian Local 48. 3 years later, most Italian women could join the dressmakers Local 89. And then just a final slide from Dan Katz, and one that I find this really, really powerful. During this period, manufacturers began to hire thousands of Black and Puerto Rican workers as strikebreakers, hoping to foment interracial and inter-ethnic discord. But in a truly exceptional moment in American labor history, rather than blame and combat the interlopers, the ILGW developed strategies to turn the strikebreakers into union loyalists. More so at times when communist Jews had formed parallel unions in the garment industry, they similarly appealed to Black workers in particular. And that's it for the Dan Katz's slide. Now, Dan Katz's argument, and I think he's right, is that multiculturalism, as we know it, really is shaped and forged in the labor movement and through these various ethnic groups who end up in the same industry and are faced with this question, of how they should relate to themselves and relate to each other in order to do the most effective organizing. I think the Garment Workers Union was really successful there. And in fact, though the name has changed, the union survives today as part of the union Unite Here, which is actually one of the better ones. Now, I am wrapping up some stuff because I do want to turn to Brit, who has some really great stuff to share with y'all. But just a couple more stuff. Another lesson I think we can learn from the uprising and the labor organizing around this time is about the character of mass movements. Now, think of the worker circle as a community that also inspired political action, like organically through what they were doing. And we'll talk more about what this legacy might mean for today. And Brit, again, is really going to drive that home, especially as it relates to Columbia. But I will just say that in my opinion, and from what I learned from this, is that we really need to mobilize communities, and not just have nonprofits, turn out a couple hundred folks for a one-off action kind of thing. We need sustained communal engagement, and that's really the only way that the left is going to build power, through institutions that actually build that up. Labor history, of course, is ripe with examples of this. I'm inspired by the fact that Workers' Circle was a movement incubator, a mutual aid society, and also this unionist sort of organization. It's all these things. But the point is, they understand that they're grounded in a set of principles, and that this is something they're in for the long haul. They're dedicated to the labor movement. And that dedication isn't just based on one situation at the time, or because they felt it was a good moral thing to do to support working people. Actually, it was based in understanding that they were very concretely being oppressed and exploited by their bosses in sweatshops and other places. And so solidarity and unionism is literally the only way to develop the power to combat that. And that's why they were so successful and able to do some incredible organizing. I think there's what we can learn from today. Oh, I just see someone dropped in the chat about Unite Here. Yes, we love it. I had a bit to say about the kosher meat strike of 1902. I'm going to skip through it and basically just say that this is a really cool thing that folks should look up. And just to say very quickly that basically, yeah, that's the picture. And a bunch of middle-aged Jewish moms and housewives were smashing windows and rioting over the price of kosher meat, and they won. So cool stuff. The takeaway here is that direct action gets the goods. And let's see what I can move on to from there. So, I mean, just first off, imagine Orthodox Jewish women breaking the windows of other Jewish butchers over the price of meat. I think that's cool. As someone, I was actually raised Orthodox, and I can't imagine my mother doing that. And I think it's just so fascinating. And again, direct action gets the good deal. So, and maybe another minute or two, literally, before I transition to Brit. Another stat I just want to trot out to show how common and pervasive socialism was in the Jewish community at the time is that in 1920, Eugene Debs runs for president from jail. Yeah, that's Debs right there. He's on the Socialist Party ticket. He ran a bunch of times. I'm not sure which campaign this was from. I can't actually see. Maybe that says 1904. My vision is terrible. But in 1920, he runs for the final time from jail. He'd been jailed because he was speaking out against World War I. And the liberal Woodrow Wilson, on his 5th time running, the liberal Woodrow Wilson, totally criminalized dissent, and he runs from jail, Debs, and gets 3% of the national vote. And you might think, hey, not bad for a socialist, running at that time. Well, guess what? Guess how many Jews voted for him at that time? 38% of the Jewish community at that time voted, or of Jews that voted for him. So that's pretty wild, and I think very inspiring. Where I'm going to leave it and then hand it to Brit is just to say that this is the early 20th century history, and I hope you find it like half as interesting and inspiring as I do. And there's a whole history to the workers' circle and a lot of stuff that goes on. In 1930, there's a very intense split where actually the radicals, communists in the organization, actually split off from the workers' circle who were socialist. And this was, a lot of it was over the question of what to do around the Soviet Union. Communists split off, form an organization called the International Workers' Order, which was historic in its own right. So this was like a big deal. And the IWO, by the way, had like the Jewish section, it had the Italian, it had a lot of folks. But by the 30s, the workers' circle absorbs into the New Deal and moves from socialism to liberalism. I want to end there because that's actually where the community as we know it today, for Jews who are involved today, sort of comes into focus. But this older history more speaks to what we're trying to convey, to recover, and to use to speak to the current moment. So thank you for bearing with me. I hope I didn't drone on too long. But speaking of the current moment, we are going to turn to the always fantastic Brit Zach to talk for a bit about what does this all mean for us today in the here and now. Brit, take it away.
Yeah, so thank you, Jonathan, for that survey. I always learn something new when you do that. But we wanted to talk about that historic moment because there's so many commonalities between that and where we are now. So the increased economic inequality that we see, a rollback of New Deal era welfare state labor protections, emboldened racism and more public anti-Semitism and xenophobia, not that there's more of it, but that it is emboldened. And renewed search for our roots and community during this pandemic when we're all sort of groundless and people are very isolated and individualized. Now more than ever, it's important to show up in solidarity. But it's also important as Jews in particular to show up in solidarity with this strike and with other liberation movements. So when we started the Worker Circle College Network, we were responding to a void in the Jewish communal and progressive landscape. We wanted a place where we could ground our organizing authentically in the rich history that Jonathan just spoke about, while acknowledging the privilege many of us have acquired after decades of assimilating into American liberalism and capitalism, and without watering down our history into kitsch Yiddish slogans. I also just wanted to say that Jonathan and I aren't here to rhapsodize about how cool and perfect the Jewish community or even Jewish leftists have been since the 1900s. There have absolutely been many lapses and shortcomings in solidarity within the Jewish establishment. So Mark Rudd, who spoke at the teach-in Friday about the Columbia student uprising of 1968, I think sums up this phenomenon pretty nicely in an article he wrote about the Jewishness of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, where he muses that his rabbi, quote, was fond of telling us that the Torah enjoins us to honor the stranger because we were strangers in Europe 46 or 117 times. Whatever the number, it was probably one of those laws that needed to be reiterated continually because nobody was observing it. End quote. So basically, I just wanted to say American Jews can't just rest on these laurels and these amazing socialist moments that Jonathan was talking about, but we need to continually show up for the work in solidarity with other groups, like in this strike. So Mark Rudd also wrote that more than half of the Columbia Students for a Democratic Society were Jewish when he was at Columbia in the 60s. So there's a history of Jewish leftist involvement here. It's not an uncomplicated one. As some of you may know, during the uprising of 1968, the Student Afro Society protested separately from SDS along racial lines, which could have its whole, a separate talk all on its own. But that history is a part of the legacy of Jewish labor unions organizing and of groups like the Worker Circle that worked with them, and the deep Jewish involvement with socialists, communists, and the left. So we feel natural here and like we fit in. And one thing that comes across from our history is this sense of being a part of the working class in a shared class struggle against bosses and capitalist dominated political parties. But we also get a deep set of ideals and an analysis of the workers' place in the world and what the Jewish workers' place in the world is too. And that really lends itself well to the kind of perspective and organizing we see going on today with this strike, and that we need more of in order to win demands and build power. So organized labor never stopped being under attack. We know because if you look at the last 40 years of American history and stagnant wages at best for most workers, and the decline of unions and workers' organizations, you can see a very clear correlation between worse conditions and the erosion of the labor movement. The other side went back on the offensive. And we're not saying Columbia is literally running sweatshops, but we think it's important to take this analysis and apply it to the university level. Because no matter how much the university touts its progressivism, it is subject to its own political forces and financial control, and that balance of power and material reality impacts the conditions facing all students, and especially international students, students of color, and student workers. This is evident when you look at the way Columbia has dealt with the graduate workers union. Tuition is expensive, and grad student workers and undergrad workers of all kinds should be allowed to unionize, but Columbia is only including fully funded PhD workers in its bargaining process, which is denying hundreds of student workers benefits. And within that, they're even whittling down the workers they're purporting to bargain fairly with, preying on international students by excluding them from pay grievance procedures while abroad, which is a classic boss tactic to sow division and divide the workforce. Columbia is also refusing to allow workers to take leave to care for sick family members during a global pandemic, which I think is pretty outstanding. And it's also refusing to allow outside arbitration for harassment and discrimination complaints. And it's actually gotten worse on this since the negotiating and bargaining process began. So in conclusion, it's imperative to stand in solidarity with the Graduate Workers Union and demand protections and fair dealings for them and for the workers at the university. Before I hand it back to Jonathan, I want to reiterate that it's important that Jewish leftists are a part of this coalition. The work we do at the Workers Circle College Network is informed by our history and by the ongoing struggles like these. So if you're listening and you're interested, you can email us at college@circle.org, follow us on Instagram, get in touch with me. I'm around on the internet and in a lot of places because we want to be doing good education and good political work from a leftist Jewish perspective. And we want to continue supporting the strike. And we're hopefully getting involved with some Green New Deal organizing soon. And we'd like to reclaim the Jewish socialist heritage we're talking about today as a vibrant and viable part of American Jewish life, as it was for so much of our history. So thank you. And Jonathan, you want to close?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for just really bringing it home. And I know I talked for quite a bit and actually longer than I intended, but this is really, I mean, that's the important stuff, right? Because we're here in solidarity, with this strike, and especially, I mean, it's just baked into the fabric of our organization, that workers deserve unions, and we see the way that that Columbia has been dealing with it, and so, like, whatever rhetoric that they might put out is just not enough to cover what we know is the reality, and which the organizers have so effectively and are so effectively calling attention to. So really, and again, we're just, we're happy to be here, and yeah, Brit was plugging the college network, and we're trying to organize from this perspective and see what it means to us today, see what we might learn from it. So I'm going to recap so quick before we open it up to any questions you might have, and please, feel free to do those. But just to sort of offer some of the big takeaways that I think we can see from all of this history and this legacy is, number one, mass movements are important. Right, we need massive mobilization of workers, and students, of course, have a role to play there too. We need big coalitions if we're going to win and shift power. And I think we really see this actually going on now in the strike. And that's so much of why we're in admiration of the work that you organizers are doing. And so frankly, it's just it's really exciting to see. Another thing that we take from this is that we need to be able to meet people where they're at, but also push them into deeper engagement with other people with whom maybe they are not comfortable with, maybe they don't know, maybe they're a different culture. As part of a multi-ethnic, multi-racial coalition. Like, if we're actually going to build a left, like, we have to be able to do that. And that's why I really wanted to share all that stuff about that Dan Katz article, and how the bosses were like, hey, we're going to bring these other workers, maybe they're from another place, maybe they have darker skin, and that'll create the wedge. And that presents its challenges, but the union was like, basically gave them the finger and said, like, no, like, we're going to all bring our own cultural environment to this work, and we're actually going to use that as a way of creating solidarity, and not sort of retreating into some silos. Three, we got to focus on material conditions that are facing us at the time, which again, the strike organizers and participants are doing so beautifully. But at the same time, we also have to be grounded in a deep analysis of power relations. Political education is important, right? And we need to understand this sort of that understanding that the relationship between a boss and a worker, like that, there's a basic tension there, and that's key to the socialist analysis. So that's part of it. And four, one reason that unions are really good, though certainly not imperfect. I mean, don't get me started on on the state of labor today and what we need to do to sort of get back to that original spirit. I almost got started on it, but I am restraining myself. But unions are good because they identify where workers have power. I do want to give a shout out. If my friend John Mermelstein is still here and watching, I was just with him at the Hunts Point strike in the Bronx on Friday night, where AOC was there giving out pizza, and that was really cool. I guess I shouldn't say AOC for president 2028, but but I'm thinking it. And General Secretary AOC. No, I'm messing there. But really, she just proved herself as a hero of the people, giving out pizza and just sort of and mingling with folks. And by the way, a lot of those union guys are like white collar, like working class folks who, there's a lot. Irish guys, if you saw the movie, like The Irishman, that was literally the Teamsters union. It's like Jimmy Hoffa. And so AOC, who's, a Latino woman and a woman of color, is sort of, mingling naturally. I mean, these are the conditions that foster solidarity. So that was really beautiful. And unions are good because they identify where workers have power. Well, where do students have power? With their money, right? And so y'all are calling attention to that, and Brit was speaking to those demands, with the grad student union, and that's fantastic. Number five, I'm going to echo again what Brit said very, very beautifully about the Jewish community not resting on its laurels. I mean, we hear a lot of the time, one thing that probably most of the Jewish people in the audience will recognize is, well, Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Martin Luther King. And, Heschel was a rabbi at the time. He was one of sort of, MLK's sidekicks. Well, there's a risk even in playing up this history. And I'm so glad that Brit actually, when we were going over, prepping for this, Brit was like, wait a second, I want to make sure to say, we're not saying to rest on our laurels just because this turn of the century history is a little more radical and less liberal. Like, no, we can't rest on our laurels. So again, just echoing what Brit said, we call on the Jewish community at Columbia and Barnard to really support these demands, and especially to focus, on a democratic vision of life at the university, and especially the unionization efforts and building worker power on campus. Because unions are kosher, and dare I say it, the administration here is treif. That is like a Yiddish word for not kosher. And so that's basically it. And yeah, I just also want to say that though I have a bunch of friends and comrades who were born into like Jewish socialist families, maybe they're like third or fourth generation worker circle. Most of us, including me and Brit, are actually coming, we're coming from like other perspectives. We weren't born with this, we weren't raised in this. We're adopting it because it sort of speaks to us. So, a lot of this for us is about, at the college network organizational level, is about rediscovering this radical heritage and finding that it not only guides us politically in a lot of ways, but also grounds us in our heritage and what I think Brit described as a seeming, a groundless time with the pandemic and, just with where we're at in the country in general. So that's who we are, and that's how we feel. And really thanks so much to the organizers, to every other person and group that's supported and spoken. We know there's a host of really great coalition members. So again, to the grad student union, student workers, we stand with you. We're happy and ready to support you however we can. And thanks for giving us space to do a little bit of political education and, to highlight some of these demands. And that's what I got. Thanks for letting Brit and I talk about this stuff.
Okay, amazing. Thanks so much. That was so informative and really cool to watch. So I guess we could have like a few minutes for Q&A if people feel like they want to stay a bit over 5. I don't know, Jonathan, if you are able to do that.
Yeah, I'm okay. I would say, yeah, it would be good to go a little 5-10 minutes over if we had to. Yeah.
All right, cool. So yeah, if people have questions, just drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. But yeah, so the first question that I had, and this is for Jonathan, is just, could you elaborate further on how you came to this particular leftist Jewish tradition?
Yeah, that's a whole thing. But I've gotten okay at putting it pretty succinctly. I mean, for me, I was raised in a pretty right-wing Jewish community, and I might have mentioned before, as I often do, that I was raised modern Orthodox, which basically means like, we observed the Sabbath and like, like I went to Jewish day school where half the day was like Judaic studies and traditional in that respect, but not quite like you'll see with Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. Actually, not quite like that at all, but pretty observant. And so again, I don't really have any socialist history in my family, and certainly had no connection to the workers' circle. But actually in high school, I started reading a lot of Noam Chomsky. I know that's like a classic DSA bro like thing, like Chomsky radicalized me, but he literally did. And yeah, actually, one of my friends who I think is also in the chat right now, we joke that he's like the Rebbe, like the rabbi. Reading Chomsky changed me a lot, and I think just actually realizing that that I could be a Jew and a leftist at the same time. Like it was surprising to me that there was this whole tradition, because I sort of felt like it had been hidden from me. And so realizing that these things were not intentions with each other was really big. And now I'm just like a Jewish socialist who's very proud of it. So yeah.
All right, awesome. And then, so the next question that I had was, to what extent do you think Jewish socialism is making a revival today? And what does that mean for the Jewish community? and also for the left. And I'm gonna give that to Brit first.
Yeah, this question actually reminds me of sort of like the ostensibly secular nature of the worker circle. Like it definitely started when that was sort of a way to set yourself apart from like the mainstream and as an expression of this sort of leftism. But like now where, you know, moving in the secular direction actually feels like more mainstream than not in many ways. I think people are looking for a community that's like beyond secular, not just secular, but secular with like a real identity and purpose. So in that extent, I think Jewish socialism is making a revival as people want that sort of community. As for the Jewish community, I think, you know, engaging youth has always been like a big struggle for like mainstream Jewish institutions. And I think it's definitely sort of time that we are like communicating our values to those institutions and really saying like, you do have to speak to these issues that are relevant to young American Jews in order to keep that engagement. And hopefully that'll drive the community further left at an organizational level.
Okay, awesome. And then we have two questions from attendees. So Rachel asks, such an awesome talk. And do you have any books you'd recommend on queer and or women Jewish organizers?
Should I take that, Britt? I'm thinking out loud. Should
Go for it. Yeah, I have not organizers, but Jewish women, so go for it.
Well, you could, okay. But if you think of something about Jewish, but I'm thinking, there was this book that I came across, and I'm literally Googling right now, and I think it was an anthology on Yes, it's. I hope this is speaking to what you're saying, but Jewish radical feminism: voices from the women's liberation movement. Oh yeah, my man Yoni in the chat, aka Jonathan Glerter, says "Living My Life" by Emma Goldman. Though I will point out she was an anarchist, and so we're socialists. So, but no, we stand Red Emma. But yeah, I'm gonna just say it again. Jewish radical feminism: voices from the women's liberation movement. I'm gonna try putting that in the chat actually, so everyone can see it. 1 second, please. Yeah, actually, if you just Google radical Jewish feminism, yeah, the first link is Amazon, so like F that, but there's one from NYU Press actually, which might be a bit better. So yeah.
All right, cool. And then the next question from an anonymous attendee is, what is the place of the explicitly religious part of our tradition in this struggle?
I can take this because I consider myself religious, and for me, like, I think I mentioned this a little bit when I was speaking about this like verse that people reiterate about this. You know, we were strangers in Egypt, so because of that, like we need to support refugees. So like organizations like HIAS, exist on that framework, and I definitely think. If it's like meaningful to you or meaningful to anyone to ground their organizing in those sort of traditions you can pull out from scripture, that's, the more power to you. I personally, I like them, but I think it's more universalist than that. I think you don't have to be like religious to be a leftist, but if your religion informs your leftism, by all means.
Yeah, and I would just, for me, it's interesting because again, I coming from that background and then sort of in a way giving it up, like it's like sort of a weird thing. But I do feel that the older I get, actually, the more I do feel like one of the things that was kind of cool about like the like OG like secular Jewish left was like they were conversant in the language of the shtetl and in the language actually of the Torah, the Old Testament, though, and I'll just call it the Torah. But they knew what they were rebelling against. if that makes sense. And I think that Yoni chimes in with the original testament in the chat. And I think the more and more I go on, I think that's important to really to understand, like, where, like, if you're gonna reject this, like, understand like what actually underlies the tradition. And I think a really good way of illustrating that was what Clara Lemlich said when she did that thing, and she was like, "Yeah, let my arm wither away." Like, that was a reference to this sort of traditional thing that, like, actually religious, like, Jewish families would say. So that was a spin on that. And she's saying that even though it's all these secular lefties in the room, and that strikes a chord. And I think that's part of actually what gives this almost like biblical fervor to these like very fiery, like dope, like lefty activists. And Brit, I'm not even gonna say, can you read your comment out loud, please?
I said also Shabbat is anti-capitalist, so you're like not supposed to do anything for a day. It's very nice.
Yeah, no, but actually, like, when Jewish workers were coming to this country, like, it was like a cliche that they knew they would be fired for not working on Saturday, because guess what, y'all, the weekend didn't exist. And that's something to bear in mind. So in a real way, Brit Zach, Shabbat is anti-capitalist. We will quote you on that. Radical Jewish vibes. One other super interesting thing. Ooh, I had a thought and I might have just lost it. No, I saw this Jacobin article and it was like, one day off every 7 years, like, we should demand that. And actually, so, my girlfriend Naomi tagged me in that and was like, oh, they discovered Shemitah. Now, Shemitah is this concept in the Torah where every 7 years you sort of take a break from farming the land, and I think like debts are freed and sort of stuff like that. I think, Brit, you're nodding. I'm not 100% sure.
I don't remember the details, but that sounds, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Jacobin discovered Shemitah, and I was joking. I was like, come on, like, the Torah was written like thousands of years ago. But no, anyway, so someone chimed in, debts only at Jubilee, 50 years. Okay. So, but the point is that after 7 years, there's this idea of sort of just like 7 days, the Sabbath, there's this sort of idea of rest and like not orienting yourself around work and production. Wow. Of course, there's also a lot of weird stuff in the Torah as well. So we're not going to be like uncritical stands. And again, we're like secular for a reason. But yeah, I think that covers it between what we've said. Like, it's good to be conversant in tradition, I think, even if you're going to reject it. So.
Okay, cool. And then so one more audience question that someone posed. So they said, I worked at Columbia University Press in the early 80s and saw workers wearing buttons that said, you can't eat prestige. Apparently the administration was telling them they should be satisfied that they worked for such a prestigious institution. And then the question is this framework being used in the current labor dispute?
I think that it's probably better directed to the graduate workers union organizers. I'm not sure if they're using that, but that's a great button. That's so important, because that's definitely like the undergrad workers are being hit by tuition and by these like being excluded from the bargaining and sort of having all of this like expenditure justified by prestige all the time.
Right, like you should be grateful to like be like a precarious like adjunct or whatever, or like grad student worker at at a prestigious university. And that's crazy. I also think, by the way, like that's true of like white collar work these days in general, increasingly, especially if you're young, where it's like that this sort of increasing precariousness, but then people are like, well, you should be lucky to have a job, or you should be lucky you work in an office, you're not breaking your back. So again, that is a fantastic question. Brit's right. Hit up the grad student union workers about that. In fact, we'll look into it because it's interesting. But yeah, I would imagine that is being used. Be grateful, and props to all the organizers for saying like, no, actually, we're not going to do that, and we're going to organize and fighting for power. Because you deserve it, but you all know that it's not going to come unless you take it. So yeah, let's take it.
All right, awesome. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you all. So I'm going to make just a few announcements again here at the end. So like Brit said earlier, you can follow Worker Circle on social media and also get in touch if you are interested in being involved. And also just to plug this upcoming event, if you're interested in more events by Worker Circle, yeah, I'll share a link to this in the chat. So this is a 3-part series on exploring systemic racism through the lens of Yiddish culture. So it should be really cool. That's the RSVP link to the first one. And also if you just want to read more about Worker Circle, you can also check out this article. And then finally, just some tuition strike related announcements. So one is a very important announcement is that Columbia is retaliating against tuition strikers right now. They announced that there would not be late fees and confirmed with us that that would not be the case for the January 22nd deadline, but then imposed late fees anyways. So we're asking everyone who is able to donate to our strike fund. And if you're not able to, at least share it and it'll help it gain more traction. And also you can send a letter to administrators opposing this retaliation and supporting our demands with that link. And then also, if you're interested in getting more involved in socialist organizing, you can join DSA through that link. And if you are a current student, you can also join YDSA and find your local chapter there. And if you want to learn more about YDSA, we have our winter conference coming up, as well as a panel on student debt cancellation. And then finally, you can sign on to the demands of one of our coalition partners, Mobilize African Diaspora, here. And we have all of these links and more in one easily accessible location here. So yeah, that's it for announcements. Thank you all so much for coming. This was really awesome. This whole teach-in was like so inspiring to be a part of, and it's really amazing to like be part of this movement and see so much solidarity from so many different people. So thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, and solidarity.